Should children be taken to protests? Amanda Stanton, who's from The Bachelor, she, caused some controversy, I guess, because she was seen taking her two daughters, 5 and 8, to one of the recent Black Lives Matters demonstrations, and people online were debating whether or not children belong there. So, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I guess people would have come for me. My original plan this weekend was to take Marqueza to a protest. There were many that were happening in Toronto, both between Friday and Saturday. I know a lot of us discussed it among one another. And my original thought was she is old enough and does understand enough of what is happening. And I also want to leave a legacy with her that you have a voice. This is how you speak up. This is how you affect change. Now, of course, I'm not ignorant to the fact that we are also in the middle of a pandemic. So I had to do risk assessment, which was how much exposure will I potentially give to myself and to my daughter during a protest? Can we safely social distance? And then the other risk assessment, which is there a potential of any unrest that could physically put us into harm? So I decided to make a decision based on who was organizing the protest, and then that second part, risk assessment. It didn't end up to be any organizations that I was familiar with that ended up organizing some protests. And of course they happened, and I support them all, absolutely. But that was important to me because not all protests are created equal. And I really wanted to make sure that if I was going to go out and take a risk, that I wanted to back people who are really doing a lot of solid work. That was number one. But then number two, I realized there was intelligence potentially pointing to some people who would co-opt any of the protests this weekend, potentially with violent ends. And so I had to make the decision as a parent to take care of myself and my safety and my daughter's safety. So we chose protest in other ways. And that was doing work and reading books and talking about this with our own family members. So my daughter's 6. She understands a lot of what is going on right now. And I think that's the bottom line is, does your child understand? And what other ways of protest can you show your child to speak up and make sure they know they have a voice and they can use it?
Yeah, Mel, I really like that you were saying that because right now, as you mentioned, we were talking online about whether we were going or not. I will say I've mentioned on the show before that my son is slightly agoraphobic right now as a result of the coronavirus. It's been hard enough to get him to even walk around the block. And anytime he sees a stranger, a single stranger, he wants to cross the street. So I'm wrestling with that already. But we have been talking about things. And if he expressed an interest in going, I would support that. But I think, I will admit that I personally have a really hard time with anxiety in large crowds at the best of times. And I've also been thinking a lot about the fact when I see footage being like, oh my gosh, there still is a pandemic out there. Let's not forget that this is a risky time. It's an extra elevated risky time. And I agree. I ultimately think there are many ways you can lend your support. So if people are out there feeling like, I'm not sure I can do that, I think that's okay. You need, basically the way I see it is to impact change, we need all of the actions but to take place, but not everyone has to do the same actions. You just have to do something.
Amen.
I love that.
Yep. You don't have to occupy all the lanes. You don't have to take up all the lanes. I was at a protest last year, and it was a protest against gun violence. And a lot of teenagers were there. There were a lot of young people there. Parents brought their children. And I remember distinctly seeing members of the Amish community there. And by the way, the Amish community is also showing up for Black Lives Matter. You should read up on it. It's quite interesting. Anyway, so the Amish community was there, and some of them had like infants. And I'm not talking about 5-year-olds, but newborn babies. They were cradling them in their arms. And I remember thinking that was quite jarring. This was a protest against gun violence. And but at the same time, I realized, well, they were there because they want to protect their children. And it's the children who are often victims of gun violence. And so, of course, you want to bring to the protest the people who will be the most directly affected by it. I know that there's an argument, though, against whether or not you bring children, period, and whether or not what happens if children show up at protests for things that you don't believe in. But I think the same argument applies, where it would also be jarring to see children at, I don't know, white supremacist rallies, because then you realize who exactly is being indoctrinated and the generation of minds that is being poisoned. So it was, for me as a witness to that in person at a protest, it was something that will stay with me. And I wonder if that also is the point, when you show up at a protest, what you learn and what you take away from it.
That's really interesting, Lainey. You just sparked something in my head. I don't know if you guys can recall ever seeing those images of the Westboro Baptist Church and seeing those kids yelling, hateful things, homophobic things, people who get divorced or are in a same-sex relationship are going to hell. That is traumatizing, and you feel for those kids that they don't have a chance in this life if that's how they're starting out. I want to go to Facebook. Sharon says, I don't think the young ones that I saw in Ottawa should have been there. None had a mask on. The older kids played with their mask. Unless your children fully understand why you are there, you are just risking their health, especially during a pandemic. Sharon and Cynthia, you touched on this as well. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and this is an excellent point, Sharon. But I think taking it outside of where we are right now with the pandemic and protesting in general with your kids, even if your kids don't fully understand, I do think there's something admirable and useful in taking your kids. They might be too young to form their own opinions, but as future voters, they're not too young to learn about activism. Even though activism is controversial by nature, these are symbolic acts that end up taking on a lot of meaning, and in many cases, they affect change. They result in power. They result in something beyond the power of symbolism. If you think about the 1913 women's suffrage procession, the 1963 March on Washington, I'm okay with kids not just seeing that stuff on television, but participating in it.